The radio went silent the exact moment the truth was about to be recognized, and on that rain-soaked highway outside Dallas, Texas, everything narrowed into a corridor of flashing red and blue lights reflecting across wet asphalt as a black superbike eased to a controlled stop on the shoulder, its engine settling into a low idle that seemed to pulse with the night itself. Officer Ryan Mitchell approached first, his steps measured and procedural, eyes already forming conclusions before details could fully arrive, while Officer Daniel Brooks followed a half-step behind, scanning the rider with the certainty of someone who believed the situation had already been solved the moment it began. The rider lifted her visor slowly, revealing Maya Carter, her expression calm in a way that didn't invite questions or explanations, only observation, as rain slid down the contours of her helmet and dripped onto the pavement in steady rhythm. "Step off the bike," Mitchell said evenly, voice carrying the tone of authority shaped by repetition rather than doubt. And Maya remained still for a brief moment, not resisting, not reacting, simply present as if she were listening to something beyond the immediate words spoken to her. Then she dismounted with controlled precision, boots meeting the wet ground without urgency, her posture steady despite the tension building around the scene. Brooks shifted slightly closer, eyes moving across the superbike, its frame, its modifications, its presence on the road at this hour, while Mitchell continued with routine questions about registration and identification, unaware that each assumption being made was quietly building a structure without a foundation. Maya reached slowly into the inner pocket of her jacket, her movement deliberate and visible, ensuring there was no misunderstanding in intent, and withdrew an identification card that caught the alternating glow of the patrol lights. Mitchell accepted it, glancing down at the name, his expression unchanged at first, then subtly tightening as recognition without context created more questions than answers. The highway behind them remained indifferent, vehicles passing in blurred streaks of light, the sound of tires on wet pavement forming a constant background hum that made the moment feel isolated, almost suspended outside normal flow of time. Maya's gaze drifted briefly down the road, not distracted but attentive, as if she were accounting for variables no one else had yet considered, while Brooks exchanged a quick look with Mitchell, a silent communication shaped by uncertainty rather than confidence. The rain continued to fall in a steady, even pattern, softening edges, muting sound, and stretching silence into something heavier than speech. Mitchell looked up again from the ID card, his posture shifting slightly, the certainty he carried moments ago now interrupted by something he could not immediately categorize within protocol or expectation. Maya stood without movement, her presence unchanged, composed in a way that did not seek approval or challenge authority, but existed independently of it, as the situation around her continued to develop in ways none of them had yet fully recognized. The moment the identification card left Officer Ryan Mitchell's hand, the atmosphere shifted in a way that was not immediate but gradual, like pressure building behind glass, and he studied the information again with a slower, more deliberate focus while rain continued to fall across the highway shoulder outside Dallas, Texas, turning the patrol car lights into blurred reflections across wet metal and asphalt. Officer Daniel Brooks leaned in slightly, trying to read the name from an angle, his expression tightening with confusion rather than certainty, because the expectation of a routine traffic encounter no longer aligned with what was now in front of them. Mitchell reached for his radio with controlled hesitation and requested a standard database verification, his voice steady but noticeably more formal, while Maya Carter remained where she stood beside her superbike, hands relaxed at her sides, posture unchanged, as if the verification process itself was simply another layer of observation rather than an obstacle. The wind moved lightly across the open road, carrying the sound of distant traffic, and Maya's attention briefly shifted toward the horizon again, not anxious, not defensive, but focused in a way that suggested she was accounting for more than just the immediate interaction. Brooks stepped closer to the superbike, not touching it, but visually tracing its condition as if looking for justification that could simplify the situation back into something familiar, something enforceable under standard roadside procedure, yet nothing about the scene offered that comfort. Mitchell's radio crackled with a delayed response indicating the query was still processing, and in the absence of immediate confirmation, silence began to stretch between all three of them in a way that felt heavier than sound. Maya finally spoke in a calm and even tone, asking whether a supervisory confirmation would help clarify the situation, her words measured and respectful, without any sense of urgency. And Mitchell glanced at her briefly before responding that protocol required completion of verification steps first. Brooks shifted his weight, visibly less certain now, his earlier confidence replaced by a cautious reconsideration of how quickly assumptions had been formed. The rain intensified slightly, creating a soft veil between the highway and the distant city lights, and the Superbike's dark frame reflected intermittent flashes of red and blue, like fragmented signals in motionless time. Mitchell looked back down at the identification card, then toward Maya, then toward the radio again, as if each element existed in separate layers that had not yet aligned into a single coherent picture. Maya did not move closer or farther, maintaining a neutral distance that neither challenged nor conceded authority, her expression steady and unreadable, while the officers continued to operate within procedure even as procedure itself began to feel insufficient for the situation unfolding in front of them. The radio crackled again, still unresolved, and the uncertainty that followed did not escalate outwardly, but instead settled inwardly, changing the tone of the moment from one of assumption to one of reassessment, as the highway continued its quiet motion around a scene that had become unexpectedly still. The unresolved radio transmission lingered in the background like an unfinished sentence, and Officer Ryan Mitchell kept his focus locked on the identification card while waiting for confirmation that seemed slower than standard procedure, as if the system itself was taking additional time to reconcile what had been presented. The rain continued to fall across the highway outside Dallas, Texas, forming small streams along the shoulder and reflecting the alternating red and blue lights in a constant shimmer that made distance difficult to judge. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his stance again, now less confident in his earlier assumptions, his attention moving between Maya Carter, the Superbike, and Mitchell's increasingly silent radio, as the moment stretched beyond the boundaries of what either of them had expected when the stop began. Maya remained composed, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, as though she were observing the officers as much as they were observing her, and she briefly adjusted her position to face slightly toward the road, maintaining awareness without acknowledging tension. Mitchell pressed the radio again and requested an expedited response, his voice still controlled, but now carrying a subtle urgency that had not been present before, while the dispatcher confirmed that verification was still in progress through federal clearance channels, a detail that caused Brooks to glance up with a sharper expression. The mention of federal clearance introduced a shift that was not dramatic in appearance, but significant in implication, and Mitchell lowered the radio slightly as he absorbed the information without speaking immediately. For a brief moment, only the sound of rain and passing vehicles filled the space between them, and the highway felt larger and emptier than before, as if the world beyond the stop had receded into distance. Maya finally spoke again, her tone even and deliberate, asking if additional documentation would assist in resolving the delay, and Mitchell responded that standard protocol required patience until confirmation was complete, though his tone had softened compared to earlier. Brooks looked toward Mitchell and asked quietly whether federal clearance was common in situations like this, and Mitchell did not answer immediately, which in itself communicated more uncertainty than words could have. The Superbike stood motionless beside them, its dark frame reflecting the intermittent flashes of emergency lighting, while water droplets continued to accumulate and slide along its surface, emphasizing stillness against motion. Maya's gaze returned briefly to the officers, not with resistance, but with a calm attentiveness that suggested she was aware of how quickly interpretation could shift based on incomplete information. Mitchell checked the radio once more, then looked toward the highway ahead, as if considering whether additional support would be required, and Brooks stepped back half a step, recalibrating his position in response to the evolving situation. The rain intensified slightly again, softening visibility at the edges of the scene, and the ambient sound of traffic blended into a steady background hum that contrasted with the focused silence between the three individuals. Mitchell exhaled slowly, still waiting for confirmation, while Maya remained steady and unchanged, the delay itself becoming the defining element of the moment as uncertainty replaced assumption without any further action being taken. The air inside the glass conference room felt heavier now, as if every breath had slowed without permission. Maya Williams stood just a few steps from the long polished table, her maintenance badge still visible against the muted tones of the executive space, a detail that should have made her invisible but instead seemed to pull every eye toward her. The document on the screen in front of the legal team was still open to page 14, the clause she had mentioned lingering like a silent warning no one wanted to read twice. Jackson Hale finally lowered his pen fully, his posture tightening as he studied her with a mixture of irritation and reluctant curiosity. Around the table, executives shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that carried more uncertainty than confidence. Maya did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She simply stepped closer, close enough to point without touching the table, and when she spoke again her tone was calm, precise, almost unsettling in its clarity. She repeated what she had seen, but this time she broke it down in plain structure, explaining how the liability transfer was embedded in language designed to appear standard while quietly shifting full exposure onto Hale investments after execution. A few people leaned in despite themselves, drawn not by authority but by accuracy. One of the lawyers adjusted his glasses and pulled the contract closer, scanning faster now, page by page, as if the words had changed their shape under new light. A low murmur spread across the room, not of disbelief alone, but of recognition that something had been missed. Jackson's assistant began typing rapidly, cross-referencing terms on a tablet, his earlier confidence dissolving into measured concern. Maya continued without interruption, describing how the clause connected to surrounding sections, how one sentence altered the interpretation of multiple safeguards, how the structure of the agreement relied on assumption rather than protection. She did not accuse anyone. She did not need to. The document itself was becoming the evidence. The room that had been built for control now felt briefly unanchored, as if its hierarchy had shifted by a few degrees. Jackson finally stood, not abruptly but with a slow, controlled movement that suggested he was recalibrating rather than reacting. His eyes did not leave Maya as he asked for confirmation from his legal team, his voice lower now, stripped of earlier certainty. One of the senior analysts hesitated before admitting they would need to revisit the entire risk summary. That single admission changed the temperature in the room. Maya stepped back slightly, returning to a neutral position near the edge of the table, but her presence no longer blended into the background. It was registered, measured, and impossible to ignore. The executives around her were no longer looking at a maintenance worker who had spoken out of turn. They were looking at someone whose understanding had forced the room to reconsider its own assumptions. Jackson's expression shifted subtly, not toward agreement, but toward realization that the situation had moved beyond dismissal. He closed the folder in front of him with careful control, signaling a pause in the discussion rather than a continuation. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant city pressing against the glass walls. Maya kept her gaze steady, not challenging, not retreating, simply present as the weight of what she had revealed settled across the table. And in that silence, the structure of the room itself seemed to change, no longer defined by titles or seating positions, but by the uncomfortable fact that the truth had already entered it. Morning light cut through the tall windows of the Vale estate, turning the marble floors into sheets of pale gold that looked almost too clean to be real. Maya Williams stood near the edge of the main study, hands folded in front of her, the same quiet posture she had used in every unfamiliar room in her life. Across from her, a long table had been arranged hastily, too many chairs for a conversation that already felt like a verdict waiting to happen. Preston Vale had not spoken much since dawn. He had left early, returned with a briefcase, and now stood slightly apart from everyone else, as if even he was unsure where he belonged in the decision he had made. The tension arrived before the people did. It always did in places like this. First came the silence in the hall, then the clipped footsteps of polished shoes, then the voices that carried authority without needing to raise themselves. 3 executives from Vale Holdings entered without greeting, their eyes scanning the room, and landing on Maya almost immediately. One of them, a sharp-faced man in a navy suit, paused just long enough to make his judgment visible. "This is the consultant?" he asked, though the word consultant sounded like a mistake in his mouth. "She was cleaning the East Wing 3 days ago." The air tightened. Maya did not respond. She had learned early that reacting too quickly gave people permission to define you. Instead, she kept her gaze steady on the table, waiting. Preston finally stepped forward. "She identified a liability risk in the merger documentation that my legal team missed," he said evenly. "That alone justifies her presence here." A faint, humorless laugh came from the second executive. "With respect, Preston, she is not part of this structure. She has no clearance, no formal role, and no standing in corporate review." The words were polite on the surface but carried the weight of dismissal underneath. Maya felt it clearly, not as anger, but as pressure, like a room slowly narrowing its walls. She looked up for the first time. "I am not here to replace anyone," she said calmly. Her voice was soft but precise, the kind of calm that made people listen even when they did not want to. "I am here because someone is about to sign something they have not fully understood." The room shifted at that. Not dramatically, but enough. Papers rustled. A pen was set down. Preston's gaze flicked toward her, then back to the executives. The first executive leaned forward. "You are implying our legal department cannot read its own contracts." "I am saying," Maya replied, still steady, "that clauses designed to redistribute liability are often written to appear neutral, while shifting total exposure in ways that are not immediately visible unless you trace intent across every paragraph." A silence followed that was sharper than any interruption. The third executive, younger than the others, finally spoke. "And you learned this where exactly?" Maya did not hesitate. From experience reviewing agreements where mistakes were not forgiven by courts, only enforced. That answer landed differently. Preston saw it immediately. The room was no longer laughing. It was evaluating. But evaluation was not acceptance. The first executive closed his folder with deliberate slowness. "Even if what she says is accurate, this is not how decisions are made in a billion-dollar institution. We do not operate on intuition from someone outside the chain of command." Maya's fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed again. She did not raise her voice. "Then the chain of command should be the first to verify what it signs," she said. The words hung in the air long enough to become uncomfortable. Preston turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see it. There was conflict there now, not rejection. But conflict was dangerous. The first executive stood. "We will note this disruption in the report," he said coldly. "And we will revisit your recent staffing decisions, Preston." The implication was clear. This was no longer about Maya. It was about him. The room began to move again, chairs shifting, papers collected, the meeting dissolving into controlled distance. As the executives turned toward the door, one of them glanced back at Maya, not with anger, but with something closer to warning. Preston remained still until they were gone. Only then did the silence fully arrive, heavier than before. He finally spoke without looking at her. "They will not accept you easily." Maya nodded once. "I did not expect them to." But neither of them moved. And in that stillness, something unresolved began to form, as if the next decision would no longer be about whether she belonged in the room, but whether the room itself could remain unchanged after she had spoken. Maya remained in the room long after the door closed behind the executives. The echo of their departure faded into the long corridor, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the conversation itself. The sunlight through the tall windows had shifted slightly, moving from sharp gold to a softer, diffused glow that washed over the marble like water slowing after a storm. No one spoke. Even Preston Vale seemed unsure of what direction the moment required. He stood near the end of the table, one hand resting lightly on the edge as if grounding himself to something stable. Maya slowly turned her gaze toward the window. Outside, the estate grounds were still, perfectly maintained hedges casting thin, precise shadows across the stone walkway. A gardener moved in the distance, slow and methodical, almost invisible against the symmetry of the landscape. Everything looked controlled. Everything looked calm. But the calm did not reach the room. Inside, time felt suspended. Maya exhaled slowly, not because she was relieved, but because her body was catching up to what her mind had already processed. She had seen this pattern before. Not the exact faces, not the exact words, but the structure of resistance. First disbelief, then correction, then silence that pretended nothing had shifted. Preston finally spoke without turning toward her. "They will escalate this," he said quietly. His voice carried less authority now and more weight, like a man acknowledging a cost he had already begun to calculate. Maya nodded slightly, still looking out the window. "They were not reacting to the information," she said. "They were reacting to the source." That sentence lingered between them. Preston did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the window as well, stopping a few feet away from her. From this angle, they were no longer positioned as executive and outsider, but simply two people observing the same view from different histories. The reflection of the glass showed them both faintly layered over the estate beyond, as if the world outside was pressing gently into their conversation. "You did not soften your language," he said after a moment. It was not a criticism. It was an observation. Maya allowed a faint pause before answering. "Softening language does not change outcomes when the structure is already unstable," she said. The air between them shifted again, not tense now, but reflective. Preston looked down briefly at his own hand, then back toward the table where the documents still sat untouched. For a moment, he seemed less like the head of a company and more like someone realizing how many decisions had been made without his full awareness of their fragility. A soft chime came from somewhere deeper in the building, distant and neutral, marking the passing of time without caring about the weight of it. Maya stepped slightly closer to the table, not touching anything, simply observing the scattered papers, the printed clauses, the clean alignment of legal formatting that masked complexity underneath. "The quiet moments are usually where the structure reveals itself," she said softly. Preston turned his head toward her. "And what do you see right now?" he asked. Maya did not answer immediately. She looked at the room again, at the glass, the light, the stillness that followed confrontation. "I see hesitation," she said finally. "Not uncertainty about facts. Hesitation about what happens when facts are no longer convenient." Preston did not argue. That was the most noticeable change. Instead, he walked back toward the table and slowly sat down, as if the weight of standing had become unnecessary. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer empty of meaning. It was filled with something unspoken, a transition that had not yet chosen its direction. Maya stayed standing by the window, letting the light settle across her face, unmoving, steady, as the estate outside continued its silent routine, unaware that something inside had already begun to shift beyond repair. The stillness inside the room did not last. It never did in places where decisions carried financial weight. A subtle vibration came first from the polished surface of the table, barely noticeable, like a distant pulse trying to announce itself. Preston Vale's phone lit up without sound, then lit again, each notification stacking urgency on top of silence. He glanced down once, expecting routine updates, but his expression changed almost immediately. The calm that had settled in his posture tightened, not into panic, but into recognition. Maya noticed the shift without needing to look directly at the screen. She had seen that particular tightening of expression before in rooms where assumptions began to collapse under verified data. Preston unlocked the phone, scrolling with increasing focus. Lines of text reflected in his eyes, technical language, compliance notes, and legal escalation markers tied directly to the merger file that had been discussed earlier. His thumb stopped moving. For a long second, he did not speak. Then he stood up slowly, turning slightly away from Maya as if distance would help him process what he was reading. "They ran a secondary audit scan on the agreement," he said finally, voice lower than before. "It flagged the same liability structure you identified." The words did not land like surprise. They landed like confirmation of something he had been resisting naming. Maya remained still near the window, her attention now fully returning to the room. She did not react immediately, not because she was detached, but because she was waiting for the moment when interpretation became acceptance. Preston continued reading, eyes moving faster now. "If this clause executes under current conditions, exposure does not distribute across entities. It concentrates entirely on our side of the merger structure." He stopped again, as if letting the implications settle into physical space. The executives who had left earlier were no longer present, but their dismissal lingered like an echo that had aged poorly. Preston lowered the phone slightly and looked toward Maya for the first time with a different expression. It was not doubt anymore. It was recalibration. You saw this without access to internal systems, he said. Maya finally turned from the window. Her voice remained steady. The structure of the clause did not require access. It required tracing intent across its language. The simplicity of her answer created another silence. But this one was different. It was no longer defensive. It was reflective. Preston walked back toward the table, placing the phone down carefully as if it had become heavier than before. He looked at the documents again, but this time the pages no longer appeared neutral. They appeared exposed. If this had been signed, he said quietly, the financial responsibility would have shifted entirely onto us within a 90-day execution window. Maya nodded once. That is the intended mechanism. Preston exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries both realization and consequence. For the first time since the morning began, the hierarchy in the room felt unclear. Not reversed, not resolved, but unsettled in a way that could not be ignored. He looked at Maya again, this time without institutional framing, without assumptions of role or clearance. You did not just identify a risk, he said. You prevented an irreversible transfer of liability. Maya did not respond with pride or emotion. She simply acknowledged it with silence, as if confirming something that had already been true long before anyone else had noticed. Outside the window, the estate remained unchanged, but inside the room, the structure of authority had begun to shift in ways that no longer depended on titles or expectation. It depended on accuracy, and for the first time, everyone in the room understood exactly who had seen it first. The silence that followed Preston Vale's last statement did not feel like an ending. It felt like a pause before something irreversible. The afternoon light had shifted again, now lower and warmer, casting long geometric shapes across the table where the contract still lay open. No one moved to close it. No one needed to. The document had already stopped being the center of attention. Maya stood near the window, her posture unchanged, but her awareness had sharpened. She could feel it in the room, the subtle recalibration of perception, the way people adjusted their understanding when certainty replaced assumption. Preston remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting flat against the table as if grounding himself in something physical to stabilize what had just changed intellectually. Then he slowly stood again, this time not with hesitation, but with intention. He looked at Maya not as an external consultant, not as an anomaly in a corporate structure, but as the origin point of the correction that had just saved the entire deal from collapse. We will need to formally document your analysis, he said. His voice was controlled, but the meaning beneath it had shifted. It was no longer about permission. It was about recognition. Maya nodded slightly. The documentation is already embedded in the language of the clause, she replied. It only needs to be translated into operational correction. Preston absorbed that without interruption. For the first time, there was no pushback from the room, because the room had already lost its argument. A soft knock interrupted the moment. A senior assistant entered cautiously, holding a thin tablet, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes revealing urgency. She hesitated when she saw Maya, as if recalculating protocol. Preston gestured for her to proceed. We have confirmation from external counsel, the assistant said. They verified the risk structure. Independently, they are recommending immediate suspension of the signing process. The words settled into the room like confirmation rather than revelation. Preston closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them. So it was not theoretical, he said quietly. The assistant shook her head. No, sir. It was active exposure. Maya turned slightly away from the window now, not because she needed to see the others, but because the atmosphere had changed enough to require full awareness. Preston exhaled and looked toward her again. You prevented execution at the final stage, he said. If this had reached signature, reversal would have required litigation across multiple jurisdictions. Maya did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her tone remained even. The structure of agreements like this is not designed to be reversed after execution, she said. It is designed to make reversal economically impossible. That statement created a new kind of silence. Not shock, not disbelief, but understanding layered with discomfort. Preston slowly walked around the table, stopping closer to where she stood. For the first time, The distance between them felt minimal, not physically, but structurally. "You are not functioning at the level of a temporary consultant," he said. Maya met his gaze directly. "Titles are irrelevant to the outcome," she replied. The assistant shifted slightly near the doorway, uncertain whether she should remain. Preston did not dismiss her. Instead, he made a decision that felt immediate but not impulsive. "Prepare a formal advisory designation," he said. "Effective immediately. She will be included in all merger review processes." The assistant hesitated for half a second before nodding and stepping out. The door closed softly, leaving only the two of them in the room again. Outside, the estate remained unchanged, but inside, something fundamental had been restructured without announcement. Preston looked at the documents once more, then back at Maya. "What you identified today changes the trajectory of this entire acquisition," he said. Maya's expression did not shift. "It corrects it," she replied simply. And in that single word, the conversation ended, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood. The estate was already quiet again by the time the decision settled into reality. Not the kind of quiet that comes from absence, but the kind that follows restructuring, where every sound now feels slightly delayed, as if the building itself is adjusting to a new internal logic. Maya stood in the same position near the window, but the light had shifted again, now softer and lower, painting the glass in long amber reflections that blurred the boundary between inside and outside. Preston Vale remained near the table, no longer reviewing documents, no longer checking messages. Instead, he was watching the space where decisions had just been rewritten in real time. The advisory designation had already been initiated. Notifications had already been sent. Systems had already updated access protocols across internal review channels. And yet, none of that felt like the real change. The real change was in the silence between them. Maya finally moved away from the window, walking slowly toward the center of the room. Her steps were measured, not hesitant, but precise, as if she was aligning herself with a structure that had only just acknowledged her presence. Preston looked up as she approached. There was no longer any trace of dismissal in his expression, only recognition, tempered by the awareness of scale. "Your analysis will be part of the executive review tomorrow morning," he said. Maya nodded once. "Then the decision will no longer be based on assumption," she replied. Preston studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small, controlled nod. Outside, the wind moved lightly through the estate trees, causing a faint ripple across the glass reflections in the room. It was the first natural motion in a space that had otherwise felt suspended for hours. Preston walked toward the side of the table and picked up the contract once more. This time, he did not open it. Instead, he closed it carefully, aligning the edges with deliberate precision. The action was simple, but it carried finality. "This document will not proceed in its current form," he said. There was no question in his voice. Maya observed the gesture, then shifted her attention back to him. "Correction is only the first stage," she said. "Implementation determines whether the correction has value." Preston acknowledged that without hesitation. For the first time since she had entered the estate, there was no resistance in the structure around her presence. Only recalibration. A subtle notification chimed again from Preston's phone, but he did not look at it immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Maya. "There is something else," he said. His tone had changed again, not urgent, but deliberate. Maya waited. Preston continued. "The board will request a formal explanation of how this was identified before execution. They will want to understand the process, not just the outcome." Maya understood immediately. It was not just about the clause anymore. It was about legitimacy within systems that often required validation before acceptance. "Then I will provide the structural breakdown," she said. "Line by line if necessary." Preston nodded once. "They will challenge the source," he added. Maya's expression remained steady. "They always do," she replied. The simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any formal defense could have. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The estate outside continued its quiet, indifferent rhythm, as if nothing significant had occurred inside its walls. But inside the room, the hierarchy that had defined every earlier interaction no longer held its original shape. Preston finally stepped back slightly, allowing space between them that now felt less like separation and more like acknowledgment. You are no longer outside this process, he said. Maya responded without hesitation. I never was, she said quietly. And in that moment, the room settled into something new. Not conflict, not resolution, but alignment built from correction rather than assumption. The sunlight faded further across the glass, and the estate outside continued unchanged. But inside, the system had already begun to move differently, shaped by the recognition that what had been invisible before was now impossible to ignore.